you feel most at home?
Well, probably Rock Island, Illinois, where I went to high school. They were probably, as you say, the best years. Prosperity and prestige-wise. My dad was general manager, superintendent, employment man, the works at the Service Rubber Company, which made athletic rubber footwear, predecessors to Nike and that sort of stuff. And I went to high school, St. Joseph's, and since service was the second largest industry in town, Rock Island Stove was the biggest one. And I got away with murder. I did everything. There were few cars in the town, and Dad had a Studebaker with plain white wood wheels that was readily identifiable, and I drove it around town and parked it anywhere, and was treated like a boss, the police departments and all that crap. And I got an allowance of $10 a week, and I was king of the hill. Spoiled brat. So I would say those were probably best years for me.
What happened when your dad relocated to Akron?
Well, that's exactly why we settled in Akron. Was that, at that time, I just got out of high school and I went to work immediately, and for the railroad, CB&Q, Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. I went to work on a temporary 90-day job right out of high school, working in the office, freight office. And when I finished the 90-day probation or 90-day temporary vacation relief job it was supposed to be, why they wanted me to take a job in Peoria, the division headquarters, which was about 90 miles away from home. And I was 17 years old. My parents wouldn't let me move to Peoria by myself. And so Dad was out of work. He came over to Akron and got a job with Firestone. And I don't know why, but when he came over to go to work, I came with him. Mother, of course, stayed home in Rock Island to wrap up the house and settle, and we had to find a place over here.
Some of our kids were born before the war, and I was born after the war, but I think the war probably World War II had a big impact on the family in America and Akron, and maybe you might want to tell us a little bit about what it was like when you were in the service, and then what it was like to go through the war years in Akron, working in the rubber shop and in the industry that really did a lot to support the war effort.
Well, of course, the war had nothing to do with my service. My military service was not during wartime. That's a nasty, I don't know, follies of youth, I guess, is the only way you could call it that. And when I got out of high school, my dad, of course, had been out of work for a while. As a senior in high school, I had registered and been accepted to Notre Dame, but when my dad lost his job, quit his job over other things that my mother and I considered rather trivial, but he didn't. I had to send a withdrawal to Notre Dame, and so we didn't have any money, so I was going to work for a year and and then go to college somewhere after we straightened out the financial situation. But I went to work at Firestone factory for that year, and I wasn't getting anywhere. I didn't like the idea. And I got the silly notion that I should join the Air Corps because I wanted to fly airplanes. And of course the military was working. This was in 1929, and peacetime, of course, and before the big crash, but things were tapering off. You know, the big crash was not an abrupt sort of thing. It kind of sloped downward. The business was kind of tailing off before the big crash. And during that time, they conned me into enlisting in the Air Force for a 3-year enlistment with the promise that I could take examinations and all that and apply for flying cadet appointments. To be a candidate for flying cadet at that time, one of the requirements was 2 years of college for preliminaries. But I was assured, since I had about 1.5 years credits that I had accumulated at Akron U in a 1-year period, that I could take the examination as an enlisted man, and that there were a certain number of appointments that were reserved for enlisted people to move up, and I would have no trouble passing the exam and all that stuff. So I foolishly went in, and that's when I got soured on government promises, because government promises lots of things and they very seldom deliver. So I enlisted, and as soon as I was eligible, after I'd gone through the rookie camp, which was a lot of other experiences that would take too long to explain to you, I took the examination, the mental examination, and passed all the questions with flying colors and whatever, but all it got me eventually was a quote volunteer quote status as an instructor in a post school, which was a side moonlight job to my clerk job in the headquarters. And that was a very revealing situation, because the lineup in the service, and we had the post commander was a lieutenant colonel, and then under him was the guy that did administrative work. Of course, the post adjutant was a captain, and the captain had a sergeant major who was actually the clerk, did the work, and I was the clerk assistant to the sergeant major. So going through this, I had daily contact with the post commander and the adjutant and all that stuff, and I was still just a rookie. But after passing the written test for flying cadet, I was sent to the hospital for physical examination. And the major who was in charge of the medical department declared that I had a defective ear, showed scars from a fractured eardrum or whatever, and I was unsuitable for flying duty, physically disqualified. So I kind of 3-day pass from my division commander, took a quick trip back to Akron, visited the leading Ohio eye, ear, nose, and throat specialist who examined my ears and said there was a minor irregularity in the texture of the eardrum, but there was absolutely nothing wrong with it. It was like the ridge in a leaf or something that was natural and not a rupture scar or anything like that. And I said, well, you give me a notarized, certified statement to that effect that I could take back? Oh, sure. So he gave me this statement, and I went back to the post and brought the statement into the post commander. At that time, as an appeal for this medical exam, and he read his speech, and he said, oh, look, and he sat like this, and he said, well, Mike, he said, you haven't been in here long enough to learn how the Army operates. He said, I'm going to tell you something. He says, this certificate means nothing. He said, if Major Glenn come in here now and told me that you were dead, he said, I'd wrap up your stuff and send it home to your people. So when I first came to Akron, and I was a single fellow just out of high school, and I started some way dating a girl that lived down in Barberton. And I took her to a dance at the KSC Hall one time, and your mother was at that dance with my current date's brother. And of course we swapped dances and all that kind of stuff. And did that 2 or 3 times, and then it was kind of funny in a way. For some reason I went to one dance by myself, and she was there with her date, Charlie, and for some reason I conned her into standing him up and leaving with me. I conned her into coming down to Old Point Comfort, and we got married at St. Mary's Star of the Sea, which was the military chapel on Fort Monroe.
Didn't she bring Aunt Grace with her?
Yes, Aunt Grace was her bridesmaid. And I had the best man was a sexton from the church who put on an old battered sport coat to stand up for me during the wedding.
You didn't have the singing Elvis, though, right?
No. No. I had two 3-day passes running consecutively, so we went over to Virginia Beach and had a room on Virginia Beach for about 5 days. And Gracie went back right after the ceremony. Gracie just rode a Greyhound. They rode a Greyhound down, and Gracie went through the ceremony and went right back.
So did you guys live on post for a while, or did Mom just come back to Akron, or did you get out?
No, we did the Virginia Beach, and your Mom went back. But Gracie had already gone back before that. And Mom went back to Akron, back home, and I got out about 30 days later.
So was that around 1930?
Yeah, it was 1930s. You know, we got married on the 30th of April, and I got out on the 10th of June from home. And came home and moved in with my in-law. The family lived at 343 West Exchange, which doesn't exist anymore now.
When you were working in the factory, were they making the tube-type tires back then?
Oh yeah, sure. Everything was tubes. Everything was. A lot of experience in that area because there was a period in there when they had rules in work that, for instance, you couldn't work in a curing room handling molds and everything unless you weighed at least 200 pounds. And they also had a more or less rule that you couldn't build tires unless you weighed 160. Because tires were built on core. At that time, you had to shape them, or pre-shape them, and then cure them in a two-part mold. They were converting to what they called a drum build, the flat method of building a tire, a flat position, and then expanding it when you cured it. And this was a much simpler job. So the labor department manager came to me at one time and said they want to find out just how necessary this weight limit was, and they want to find out how light a man could really handle a tire building. So he asked me if I would try the job for 30 days, and then he promised me I could have my choice of whatever production job I wanted afterwards if I would do that. I weighed 134 pounds at the time, and of course, I had long arms and long legs, and so I went to work in building, supposedly building tires, and of course they had piecework set up in quarters, and the normal break-in period was about 2 weeks for the new builder. I made out, as they call it, made quota the second day on the job, and no hassles, no problem. So I only worked about a week on the job and had made quota every day from the second day on the rest of the week. And then they made good on their promise. I took a job on a tread extruder and making, producing Camelback. And tread material for retreading tires. I wound up running the tube machine, and which was the second highest rated job in factory. They wouldn't give me the top job, running a fabric calendar, because that was a highly skilled job. Running a tandem calendar was a big deal. And of course that was the job I asked for, but no way.
Why didn't you ask for the Banbury?
Nobody wanted Banbury, so I wound up not running the Banbury, but writing all the specs and doing all the development work for it.
Probably the young kids don't really know what the Banbury is. You might want to explain a little bit about why nobody wanted that job.
Well, if you ever had a bread dough mixer or something at home, the Banbury is a chamber machine with two counter-rotating rotors inside, which blends and mixes, puts all the chemicals together to make the rubber compounds. And we had, at the time we started in there, we had what they call number 11 Banburys, which were capacities of 400, 450 pounds of stock in a batch. And of course you add materials at different time sequences and liquids and all that sort of stuff. Have temperature controls and time controls, and so I wound up eventually writing the specifications for mixing all the stocks. Well, we also went into a larger Banbury deal too, they called it 27, which was about 2.5 times the size, mixed a batch of around 1,000 pounds. And biggest feature in Banbury is when you had softened the rubber and you added liquid oils and stuff, and then you had to put in loose carbon black to incorporate to reinforce the stock. And so, of course, Banbury's operated in the, what you call a master batch mixes, where you incorporated the carbon black, where you were working in a black cloud all day. And people didn't like that. And that naturally, that's the way we got the racial integration in the rubber industry, because during World War I, they were mixing even on open mills and that, and put all this carbon black in, and all the nice young boys were going off in the service. We couldn't get anybody to, or before my time, of course, they couldn't get anybody to work at Banbury's. There was shortage of labor, so Firestone and Goodyear, both, probably Goodrich too, I don't know about them, but they actually sent trains down into Alabama and Tennessee and so forth, and recruited people, primarily blacks, who were not eligible for the service because most of them couldn't read and write. We brought them up to Akron, they brought them up to Akron and put them on these dirty jobs.
I remember when I worked at Firestone, I got a tour of the Banbury, and I imagine, you know, by the late 60s that had been cleaned up quite a bit from what it was in the earlier part of the century. And you go down there with a white shirt on, and you might never wear that white shirt again. It was still very, very dirty, even back in the late 60s. So that was a pretty demanding job, and the places were very hot, and the curing rooms were very hot. Would they get those presses up to around 1,000 degrees or something?
No. We cured tires normally between 300 and 360 degrees Fahrenheit in a pressurized steam system. So we never ran the presses that hot, but when you got between, in the later years when they used the bag-o-matics with individual molds, if you got between two of them, it felt like 1,000 degrees when you were in between two presses that were running at, say, 330 degrees of heat, and there's no breeze stirring or anything. It got pretty warm in between. But in the days when they really were curing what they called pot heaters, we used to stack individual molds about 15 to 20 into a pot or into a sunken pit, and close the lid and heat the whole 15 or 20 all at once. That was the original curing system. And naturally, with a dozen or so of those pits around, all full molds and running an hour, 2 hours at a time, like the whole room got pretty warm. I know that they had windows all down one side of the room, and if you ever come a shower on the outside in normal weather, but everybody in the curing room would run over and stick their head out the window. I belonged to those leagues of Firestone, and I also belonged to a country club for a long time for business reasons, because well, I didn't figure I could afford a lot of that stuff, but I figured you had to do that to make progress in your business. Because regardless of what anybody says, it's not what you know, it's who you know.
Well, back then, the Firestone Country Club had a lot of people who were working in the shops that were members, and things were significantly cheaper as far as the money. Of course, the money, nobody made that kind of money as back then. People's salaries were a lot lower than that. But didn't your father also belong to Firestone?
Well, yeah, that's the only way I got in. Because contrary to public opinion, the country club was organized and built for the executive and the salary people, more or less. as a fringe. And my dad was invited to join when they first opened the club, which he did. And in order to comply with the so-called ethics and all that, technically the club was open to all employees of the company, but in reality it was being operated with a foreman supervisory staff and go after the factory people. And the second year that the club was in operation, I got into it because my dad was a member and he sponsored me to join the club. At that time I was working on a production job in the factory. And I think there were only about half a dozen factory production workers, actual workers, who were in the club. The foremen, the supervisors, the department managers, and the bookkeepers and all that, they were all in the club.
Didn't your brother play out there a lot and work out there?
Well, he didn't ever belong. He played a year or two on my dad's membership, family membership, but as a junior, he won the junior championship as a district out there, but not as a club member. He was 16, I think, at the time. And yeah, he won. I caddied for him during that tournament. And yeah, he later went to Georgia Tech and played golf for Georgia Tech on their team. And a couple of the very prominent golfers now are also members of that team. Probably not coincidentally time-wise, but one of the leading golfers, I think it is right now, is an ex-Georgia Tech member. And of course, Jerry was a brother-in-law to Herman Kaiser. He and Herman were married sisters. And of course, Herman won the Augusta Masters in, I think, around 48 or so.
And he beat Ben Hogan there?
No, I never had any acquaintance with those guys, but Dad and Jerry and I used to play in the 50s with Herman at Royal Oak. Herman, after winning the Augusta Championship, which incidentally was not a big money deal at the time, always set him up for life. I think the prize was about $30,000, but he said that didn't mean anything because he was a Augusta Masters champ. He got appearance money and fees and stuff for at least the year after. He said the year that he won the Masters for $30,000 meant $100,000 to his income. At that time was a lot of money. And he bought a half interest in the Royal Oak Golf Club with that money. And when he left the Pro Tour, he was operating as a half owner of Royal Oak in the Akron area. We used to play, the four of us. Jerry and Herman were pretty close together because Jerry had a handicap of about 2. After his Georgia Tech experience and stuff, he wasn't quite pro caliber because Herman would probably play to a scratch or maybe a -2, but they don't give minus handicaps. So, and my dad and I used to play fairly closely, although I beat him quite regularly, but not by very much. So we used to pair up. But Jerry and I would play against, Dad and I would play against her. We mixed the foursome up. And Herman and Jerry would play even, and Dad and I would play even. But Herman used to give me a stroke on all the par 5 holes. And only on the par 5s. And he had fits. Because we used to play for 10 cents a hole or 10 cents a point. Low ball, low total. And Herman used to get teed off because he'd have to pay me 10 or 20 cents, usually. And he didn't like that. He didn't mind the 10 or 20 cents, but he hated to get beat. And that was the silliest thing because he used to gripe and he'd say, Fran, he says, if I could putt like you do, he said, I'd still be on the tour. Because he would get on the green before I did, and I would have the longest putt. And I would hold a putt, and it upset him, he couldn't make his.
Well, I remember our days playing, used to still have a good putting eye, and that was much later. His Herman's championship was the year before I was born, so I wouldn't have wanted to play you when you were much younger. You'd have probably really beat me bad.
Herman had an awful long straight ball, and his irons were very accurate. He would get on the green in par figures all the time, and sometimes under par figures, but he seldom hold a long putt. Because if he was 20 feet away from the hole, but his general procedure would be to lag the ball up to within 2 feet or 3 feet or so and go for the 2. If I had a 25-footer, I'd try to sink it. And I used to get 2 or 3 of them every time we played. He didn't like that. In fact, that was another thing. I never could get the iron shots in close enough to the pin. I had a lot of long putts. That's why I got skillful at it, I guess, because I had so many of them to try. Yeah. But I don't know. We had fun.
Well, that's important, I think. I think it's great. I've certainly enjoyed the times that we've spent together on the golf course, and so I'm sure you did with your father as well. It's a great place to relax and enjoy yourself.
See, Herman and Jerry would be trying to break 70. And once in a while they would hit, 69 or something like that. But normally, those two guys at that time, it was long after Herman's championship, would normally turn it around from 72 to 74, something like that. And Dad and I would be trying to break 80. Occasionally we would hit 78 or 79, but our usual scores would be 82 to 84. So that was the way the games went.
So what was the best round that you recall ever having, score-wise, or just?
It probably depends on how you look at it. I don't know. I turned at a 74 on the Portage Country Club the first time I ever played it. That was a very exclusive club, and the only reason I could play it was because a district tournament was being played at Firestone, and the Portage Country Club joined an association around that made themselves available to all the Firestone club members could play the other clubs while the tournament was going on at our club. So I played Portage and turned in a 74. But Portage is a relatively easy course, and it plays different. It's not as long, and they have big, soft greens you can pitch into very nicely. I played Portage once after that, but it didn't duplicate the 74.
I even got to play Portage a few times. I caddied there for a number of years and worked in the 19th hole tendon bar there. And when I played, I was teaching school, and I played with some of the kids that I was teaching, and it got embarrassing. They hit the ball like 40, 50 yards further than me. That was the years that St. Vincent had a state runner-up golfing team, and so I had some experiences at Portage, not as good as yours, but I did have a lot of fun there, and wore out quite a few pairs of tennis shoes with looping there.
Well, I belonged to the Firestone Country Club, which he started before. My dad got me in the second year the club operated, and I got a family membership for $28 for the year, which was covered all the golf privileges. And at that time, we didn't have any minimums to pay at the clubhouse or anything like that. And of course, I was making about $30 a week at working in the factory. And so 28 bucks was just about a week's pay. My beloved Gertrude didn't think I should be spending that kind of money for that, but I thought it was necessary so that I could meet people and progress in my career and work. And it worked out that way because I got to know everybody, including one member, at least, of the Firestone family, which didn't do any harm.
I'm sure of that. Maybe people might...
Russell Firestone, to be honest, was the family drunk. And he belonged to the country club, and I happened to bump into him in some kind of a tournament or other on a golf course and play golf with him. And after that, he came through the factory one day, he caught me stripping some radiator hose, physically working, and he said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "Well, I'm making a living for time to." So when you'd rather be playing golf? I said, "Yeah, I sure was," but he says, "I can't afford to." He said, "Well, you got your clubs with you?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, go tell the boss," he said, "you're going on special duty with Mr. Firestone." He said, "We're going to golf course." So that happened a couple of times. He'd come down to the factory and say he wanted me to do something, would take me off the job, and the foreman would take care of my time card, and all that. I'd go out and play golf with Russell Firestone. And Russell would always have a bottle in his bag, and we used to play the same old game, 10 cents a hole for whatever. He wanted a competition, but Russell would have a nip out of the bottle at every tee. And by the time we get to about the 12th hole or so, he wasn't doing so well. And more often than not, we quit after about 12 holes, and he'd pay off for the rest of the holes because he wouldn't play anymore. So, that, well, I never did any business, but I acquired the what do you call it? Whatever. But the foreman and the department managers and so forth knew that Mr. Firestone took me for special duty.
So how did the Hibernians get started? And I know Chuck was one of the early Hibernians as well as you. And you've been, associated with that organization for a long time. And how did they get started in Akron?
Well, I don't really know. I know Chuck was one of the charter members. There was about 15 of them who gathered at the Mayflower Hotel and had organization meetings. But they had to have 15 in order to get a charter. And Chuck, I think, was on the Akron police force at the time. I believe that was what he was doing, but I'm not quite sure. But there were several Akron policemen involved, and it's Akron postal workers, but I think the real instigator, organizer was Joe Fenton. Joe Fenton was a circulation manager for the Beacon Journal who had moved over from Pittsburgh in the newspaper business, and they had Hibernians in Pittsburgh, and Joe got these grouped together and organized and applied for a charter in Hibernians. And I know Will Malloy from Malloy Nash Motors was one of them,
What was Mark Heffernan, an Akron policeman?
Mark Heffernan was an Akron police sergeant, and Steve McDonald Jr. and Sr. Steve McDonald Sr. was police captain, and he was one of the originals. And Steve Jr. was a police sergeant. Mark Heffernan, I think, was a sergeant, too, in plainclothes division.
Right. I remember the old club, I believe it was on South Main, and we used to have to go upstairs.
Yeah, I know. Well, that was the first club room we had. Well, originally, we held meetings in the basement of St. Bernard's Church, where they had a sort of a social hall, and we met there on Sunday afternoons. And, that was my first experience with having beer in the church. we were allowed to bring in beer, and they did set up a cooler in there, and we'd have beer in the meeting.
But you couldn't have bingo back then.
No, we didn't have anything else, just a meeting, and we had to drink a couple of beers. And then from there, we rented this place on South Main Street, which is about 2 doors north of the old Portage Hotel, and across the street from the bus terminal, which is now a welfare center, or was, I don't know whether it is now or not, but
That would have been right down in Main and Market area there.
yes, there's about a half a block north of the Main and Market, because it was between Market Street and the high-level bridge,
Down near where the Ohio Edison is now.
right across the street.
Your experience during the Second World War and the impact it had on the family and yourself personally. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your experience there and the things that happened?
Well, the biggest thing about the war time, as far as that goes, is that when we really got into it, I was I was a working supervisor, which is what they call the gang leader in a production in a Camelback unit. 5 men in the crew, and I was supposed to be the crew leader, you know, to kind of keep things going. And then we got a lot of war contracts, a lot of war materials to run, and they grabbed me off the production and made me a Firestone inspector for materials going to the government. And the next thing you know, we had a couple government inspectors that were supposed to come in and approve and check on the government contract work. So they transferred my allegiance to Final Inspection Department. The manager of Final Inspection was technically Firestone's chief inspector and responsible directly to the government. And they put me in charge of all materials in process throughout the whole plant that had anything to do with materials being shipped to the government. Mostly for making bulletproof fuel cells for airplanes and life rafts for the Navy and the Air Corps and stuff like that. And I was directly responsible to the government inspector. And I accused him when he called me up to the office and explained all this job to me that I accused him of putting me into that position because they want to have a scapegoat in case they got material that proved it wasn't any good. Like I was the guy that was on the hook. I could be sentenced to 5 years in jail for defrauding the government, whether I knew anything about it or not. But anyhow, I agreed to do the job, providing that I would have complete authority that if I said stuff didn't go, it didn't go. So they agreed to that, the whole management of Firestone and everything else. And later on, it proved kind of difficult because I did reject a bunch of stuff at one time, and one of our division managers said, "Fitz, you can't do this because it would cost us $10,000 or $12,000. I said, "Too bad, it's no good, the government ain't gonna get it." So that led to other stuff. Well, I'll find out about that. He said, "I'll go to the management, whatever." So he went to the executive vice president and says he had this material that was rejected by the government inspectors, and he couldn't do that. He had to ship it. And the VP said, "What did Mac say about it?" He said, "Mac said I can't ship it." He said, "Well, then you can't ship it." That was all. So that was great. And that eventually led to my job as quality control inspector in the development department after the war was over. So I ran out of other stuff. So, you know, on this capacity of inspector, we had inspection tables where we rode and inspected all the fabrics and stuff before they went out. And of course, they mixed stock, and we shipped stock in rolls and loads and bales and all that kind of stuff. And I was responsible for all that stuff in production. So I used to wander the plant and follow the mixing of the stuff and anything to do with the government. And of course, as I said, and then for a couple of years there, I know one year in particular, I had 2 days off, Christmas Day and Easter. I worked 10 hours a day, 7 days a week. And as a supervisor, I was making about $8 an hour base pay with time and a half for over 40 hours and double time for Sundays and holidays and all that sort of stuff. And so I was making more money than I'd ever made before, and actually able to properly take care of my family and pay some bills. And it led to my working in the development department after the war was over. And so as I told other people later, well, I'll get to that later, but yeah. During the course of this time, I had occasion to supervise work by several different people. One big hillbilly that came up from Virginia or whatnot, I know where he came from, but down south somewhere, a big, strong bull of a man who he couldn't read and write. He couldn't even write his own name. And he used to take his time card home and have his wife sign it. And supposed to sign your card and turn it in when you went out of the factory. And of course, every week they'd gather the time cards and figure your pay. So this guy was coming up short week after week because he didn't get his last time card back in time to get it in. So he'd be carrying over. And he and his wife complained he wasn't getting his pay on time. Eventually I wound up teaching him how to sign his name, how to write his name on the desk. Well, that was a mistake, I think, in a way, because I had a hard time then keeping him from signing everything anybody threw in front of him. Just, they came around for all these drives, United Fund and charities and war bonds and everything. He wanted to sign up for everything. And I said, you better take that home and talk to your wife first. No. So yeah, that worked out pretty good. But the other incidents, I had a colored man that worked the mill on a deal, and I used to contact him every day and correct his procedures or tag up his stuff and so forth and so on. And he was another one that he couldn't read and write. I had to set up a system of big letters to put on the tickets. So we put a ticket on it. He was supposed to mix specialty stock with on the mill, and he couldn't read the spec. So I taught him about 4 different specs, and I would mark a big A on one card, and he would follow one procedure. And so I actually taught him to differentiate the mixing procedures by one big letter, A, B, and C, I would put on the card because he couldn't read the type instructions. Well, this, of course, I used later in my career because when I was writing the specs for mixing, I classified them all as A, B, and C and used the system later. But when I got the promotion from quality inspection into the laboratory control instead of routine statistical control system, I went down through the factory and I had a guy with me, a young student rookie, and this guy turned around from his mill and said, "Oh, Mr. Mack," he said, "gee," and I'm down there going through the mill room with a white shirt and a tie on and stuff, and he said, "Gee, I'm glad to see you got a promotion." He said, "But I could never get a job like that. My face ain't the right color." And I looked at him and it kind of teed me off. I said, "What do you mean your face ain't the right color?" I didn't want to tell him that, he just didn't have it, but I told him, I said, "Yeah, it's not what you know, or not the color of your face or anything like that." I said, "It took me 16 years in a war to get off a production job." And I said, "If I had gone to Princeton and joined the same fraternity that the Firestone boys went to," I said, "I'd have probably been a vice president by now." I said, "It's not what you know or what you do, it's who you know." And I said, "You just don't happen to know the right people." I believed in the conservative principles in the first place, advocated them, and I was very much interested in breaking the barrier that seemed to exist at that time. The anti-Catholic classes used to say no Catholic could ever be elected president. And of course, they say that about a lot of things. But in any case, I was very much interested in breaking that barrier down. I was not too not too much in agreement with Kennedy's liberal principles, and I almost refused to vote at all because it turned out that Kennedy really was not a Catholic because he didn't know what the hell his religion was. He and the rest of the family claimed to be Catholic, but the Catholics are the women in Kennedy's family. when Kennedy was challenged on which affiliation he would follow, he was asked, well, if he was elected and the Pope gave him some orders, what would he do? And he said, well, he would choose his government, furnish government. If it came to a choice, the Pope would go out the window. And if he really knew his religion, he should have told him that there would, under no circumstance would there ever be a conflict, because the Catholic Church requires you to fulfill any oath, which is not evil or contrary or whatever. But when he takes his oath to uphold the constitutional laws of the United States and follow the instructions of the Congress, that if this did not agree with papal directions, why he would be bound to maintain his oath. As long as it was not requiring illegal or immoral action. So he didn't know his own religion, and I raised that issue, but I did vote for Kennedy anyhow because I wanted that barrier broken. It turned out that was wise because, after all, Nixon betrayed his trust when he got in there too, so I don't know.
Well, Nixon was a very prominent figure in American politics for probably a quarter of a century, if not longer, from the, of course, the famous Checkers speech all the way to the, I'm not a crook, and his resignation. But Nixon was a power in American politics for a long time. If you look back and look at Nixon's fate as compared to Kennedy's, anything you would, kind of opinion you'd like to verse on those two?
Well, Kennedy never really had an opportunity to establish his policies. His service was very short. It was cut short when he was assassinated. And a lot of things that he started or instigated were effective later. And I think he did accomplish some good during his short term, but I don't think he really had an opportunity to establish a standard procedure or anything like that. It was a sort of a bubble administration, I would say. Great promise and then burst with his assassination. Although there was some carryover, some of the things that he started were very good. There was nothing wrong with his administration, but he didn't really accomplish a whole lot.
Probably his biggest accomplishment was probably the Peace Corps. At least I think it was. And then, Johnson followed with a lot of social change and a lot of things like the Great Society.
I think the biggest item was the Cuban fiasco. Even though the Bay of Pigs was a really military and diplomatic failure, it alerted the Axis powers that the United States was not going to sit still and be pushed around. And I think that was probably his biggest accomplishment, was drawing the line somewhere, even though he didn't succeed in overthrowing Castro.
Well, it did keep the Soviets at bay. Back then, during the Cold War, that was a pretty critical issue back then.
Well, of course, that's another thing that people don't realize is that the United States government put Castro in. I don't care what they tell you, but they had a dictator in Cuba before, Batista, and Batista passed laws that were equivalent to what we get civil service here, which American industry in Cuba couldn't tolerate. That is, if you worked 90 days for a company, you had a lifetime job. And we Firestone had a plant down there at the time, and you couldn't modernize, you couldn't develop and eliminate any jobs, because if somebody's been working 90 days, you got to keep them on your payroll for life. And so that's the story. The State Department helped the rebels and stuff like that, and I could tell you things about that too. We shipped gun barrels into the Cuban rebels under the guise of conveyor rollers for modernizing our conveyor system in the plant, the Firestone. I was involved in that, but it was a sub-rosa operation. Actually, we had ordered, I don't know how many rollers for a revamped conveyor system. The rollers all happened to be 30 inches long with a 30 thousandths hole through the middle, and very nice gun barrels. And of course, the first shipment that we sent down there and put on the, well, we delivered from the boat or whatever onto the docks at the Firestone plant, and it mysteriously disappeared. And we had to reorder to get some replacements, which also never really arrived at the plant. And of course, nothing was ever said about that. So our State Department actually helped Castro overthrow Batista so that they could evade this lifetime commitment to the working people by law. And the result was, when Castro took power, he didn't wipe out the law like he was supposed to. He seized the plants and made them. He took the whole works. And that's why we put the embargo on Cuba, and it's still in effect now, because Castro seized our plant, he seized Goodyear plant, he seized Shell Oil plants, and stuff like that. They all became state properties now, and these companies received no compensation. At that time, our State Department said, well, if you want the plants, that's fine, you take them over, you pay for them. No. The answer was no, and so we had to put the embargo on, and the embargo still sticks. And the result is that Cuban people are suffering and not as prosperous as they were, and all that sort of stuff. And our companies are still holding the bag for heavy investments in Cuba, which they got no return on.
Well, while we're talking about politics, Brian would like to know, who's your favorite president, and while you were living, and maybe why you would pick that person as your favorite president?
Well, that's a hard question to answer, because really I don't care too much for most any of them, but I would say probably my favorite would be Eisenhower. And Eisenhower was a guy that tried to keep things running on an even keel, and you had reasonable anticipations that what he said would be done. He was an Army general, and he laid down rules, and he tried to live by the rules as much as Congress would let him, and he was a domineering character, and he got pretty much kept things on an even keel. Other than that, I had some respect for Coolidge, although he was, in my early lifetime, I wasn't too familiar with him, but Coolidge served his term and decided he didn't want to run anymore because he didn't want to mess with the dirt of politics. And so I appreciated him for his famous statement, I'm not running, and if I'm nominated, I will not run, and if I'm elected, I will not serve. So he didn't run for re-election, and that I admired. I admired Truman, although I didn't think Truman was very smart, and Roosevelt picked him as the vice president because they thought he was an easy pushover, and then in case he got into power, he wouldn't do anything anyhow, and he kind of fooled him. When he got into power, he rose for the job, and he did a good job, which nobody anticipated. So I should say that those were the ones that I, what do you call, really more or less united with, sort of followed along with.
Well, Truman was famous for his buck stops here statement, and
Well, this is right. This is the thing that I dislike all the time, is that even, as I said, back in my old military service, you could not depend on any government promise at all. And these three people tried to enforce the government so you could anticipate that they were going to do what they said they were going to do. And yeah, I give out some respect for them. Most of the others I had no respect for at all.
What do you think your father's legacy to you was?
I think his legacy probably was pretty much the same as mine as to my family. Tell the truth and don't try to evade stories. Don't try to shift blame or responsibility to anybody else. Establish your own principles and stand with them. And as I said, I think probably the truth is basic. And that's really why my second marriage didn't work out so well, because my second wife didn't know what the truth was.
Okay, we're going to sum up here. Which do you prefer, a sunrise or a sunset?
Oh, the sunrise, I guess, because it's promise for the future. The sunset's kind of wrapping things up and saying goodbye, and that doesn't fit with my mental state right now or later. It probably was beautiful when I was younger, but nowadays I don't want to look at anything being wrapped up and put away. But dawning and new